Welcome back to the KOAM Morning News. Earlier in the show, we detailed the historic rocket launch by NASA as we now have astronauts on their way to the International Space Station, and we're kind enough to be joined by Matt Rodell. Matt is the Acting Deputy Director of Earth Sciences, and Matt joins us live this morning from Clarksville, Maryland. Matt, I want to thank you for your time. Congratulations on this morning's launch. You know, coming off of our Earth Day celebrations yesterday, I kind of want to dive into what's in your cup of tea: hydrosphere, biosphere, geophysics, and that sort of thing. What exactly does the International Space Station and this crew's mission help us as far as climate change on Earth?
Well, we actually make a number of measurements from the space station. So NASA has 20 satellites that are orbiting the Earth right now, making Earth observations, but we also put instruments right on the space station, which is nice because then we can just mount them on an arm in the space station and they don't need their own satellite. And they're making numerous observations of things, everything from the health of vegetation to the types of constituents in the atmosphere, aerosols, carbon dioxide, that sort of thing, observations of the ocean. I could go on, but huge number of measurements. I think there are 16 sensors on the space station right now looking down at Earth.
What's our time frame that we have for historical knowledge from those sensors at the ISS as far as how we're able to track it on an annual, if not daily basis?
Well, those measurements in the ISS, there have been, like I said, numerous sensors that have actually changed over time, and often they're a little bit on the experimental side. When you're talking about a long record of observations from space, really need to look at our satellite observations, and those go back to the early 70s.
Wow.
Of records. Some of the first observations were things like you could just start to see where the snow cover was in the northern hemisphere, for example, and it was just like a real eye opener. Like, wow, we can really see how these things are changing over time, and those observations are really critical. As you said, having a long record allows us to see how the Earth is changing over time in response to climate change, in response to natural variability, in response to direct human impacts.
And from a weather person's perspective, we rely so much on your data, especially when it comes to hurricane season. I know you track wildfires. Look, we got some rain right here in the 4 states. I want to specifically ask about flooding and droughts and how the ISS, the sensors, and your mission can kind of help us track that.
Well, we have various observations that are relevant to drought and the water cycle in general. These include a satellite called GPM that makes global measurements of precipitation around the world. It's really been critical for hurricane monitoring, for example. We also measure things like the evapotranspiration, which is the water coming up off of the land and from the plants. When there's high heat, you get more evaporation, there's more water loss, and that can sort of enhance a drought. We look at things like the types of crops that are being planted, how they're using the water, and how stressed those crops are. So all of these things sort of add up to very useful observations when we're trying to monitor things like flooding and drought.
And Matt, coming off of today's historic launch, you've got another launch coming up. It's Landsat. How do you explain it to people and what its mission will be?
Yeah, so this is actually Landsat 9, which means it's the ninth in this long line of Landsat observing systems, going back to July of 1972, as a matter of fact. So the Landsat observations are making, it's basically an imager. So we're constantly photographing the Earth from space. And it's made some really critical observations to be able to understand how especially the land is changing over time. The example I'll give you is if you go to the Google Earth engine and look at their time-lapse machine, you can see some fantastic animations of how the Earth's been changing. So you see things like the growth of Las Vegas and how that's spread out over time. You see deforestation in the Amazon. You can see glaciers that are retreating due to global warming. So some really cool stuff if you want to check out those types of animations.
Matt Rodell, Acting Deputy Director of Earth Sciences in a number of fields for NASA. Matt, number one, congratulations on this morning's launch. Number two, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and happy day after Earth Day.
Same back to you, my man. All right, we'll be back with more KOAM Morning News right after this.